The morning mist still clung to the canals of Haarlem when Janet Johanna Schaft, known to everyone simply as Hannie, pedaled her bicycle past the German checkpoint on the Kruisweg in the spring of 1943, her basket of ration cards and forged documents hidden beneath a layer of innocent-looking vegetables. She was 21 years old, a law student at the University of Amsterdam, whose studies had been interrupted by the Nazi occupation, and to the German soldiers who waved her through, she appeared as unthreatening as any Dutch girl running errands for her family. But beneath that unassuming exterior beat the heart of a resistance fighter who would soon become the most feared woman in the Netherlands, a ghost who moved through the occupied streets with such precision that the Gestapo would eventually place a bounty of 50,000 guilders on her head, dead or alive. Hannie Schaft was not born a revolutionary. She came from a comfortable middle-class family in Haarlem. Her father a teacher who had instilled in her a fierce sense of justice, and her mother a woman of quiet strength who would later suffer terribly for her daughter's choices. The Nazi invasion of May 1940 had transformed the Netherlands from a neutral nation into a prison camp, and by 1943, the occupation had grown brutally efficient. Jewish families were being rounded up and deported eastward. Dutch workers were being shipped to German factories as slave labor, and the hunger winter of 1944-45 was still to come. Hannie had watched classmates disappear, professors arrested, and neighbors taken away in the middle of the night. Unlike many young Dutch people, she had initially responded with small acts of defiance, listening to forbidden BBC broadcasts, distributing underground newspapers, and helping Jewish friends find hiding places. But small acts were not enough for Hannie Schaft, whose legal training had taught her to see the occupation not merely as a military defeat, but as a systematic criminal enterprise that demanded a criminal response. In the summer of 1943, she made contact with the Rod van Verzet, the Council of Resistance, a communist-led organization that was among the most militant of the Dutch underground groups, and it was here that her particular talents became apparent. She was fluent in German, having studied it extensively, and her fair hair and Aryan features allowed her to pass as German when necessary. More importantly, she possessed an almost preternatural calm under pressure and a memory that could retain complex security protocols after a single explanation. Her first assignments were relatively low-risk. Courier work between resistance cells, transporting weapons and explosives, and helping to forge identity papers for Jews and resistance members who needed to disappear. But even these tasks required extraordinary nerve, as the penalty for possession of forged documents was immediate execution, and German checkpoints were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Hannie developed a series of disguises and cover stories, sometimes posing as a domestic servant, other times as a secretary, and occasionally even flirting with German soldiers to distract them from searching her bicycle basket too thoroughly. She learned to read the body language of the SS men who manned the checkpoints, to sense when a search was imminent and when she could safely pass through with a smile and a Heil Hitler that tasted like ash in her mouth. By late 1943, however, the resistance leadership had recognized that Hannie Schaft was capable of far more dangerous work, and she was recruited into a special unit tasked with direct action against high-value targets, collaborators, informants, and German officials whose elimination would disrupt the occupation apparatus. This was the work that would make her a legend, but it was also the work that would doom her, for once you have killed in cold blood, there is no going back to being a law student with her whole life ahead of her. The transformation from courier to assassin was not immediate, and contemporary accounts suggest that Hannie struggled with the moral weight of what she was being asked to do. She was not a natural killer. She was a young woman who loved poetry and music, who had dreamed of becoming a human rights lawyer, and who kept a diary in which she wrestled with the ethics of political violence. But she had also seen what the Nazis were doing to her country and her people, and she had concluded that in a world gone mad, the only sane response was to fight back with every means available. Her first assassination target was a Dutch policeman named Willem Zirkzee, a notorious collaborator who had been instrumental in rounding up Jews in Amsterdam and who was known to have personally beaten resistance suspects during interrogations. The hit was scheduled for November 1943, and Hannie was chosen to carry it out not because she was the most experienced shooter in the cell. She was not, but because she could get close to Xerxes without arousing suspicion. She spent weeks studying his routines, learning that he walked his dog every evening along the same route through the Plantage neighborhood, and she practiced with the 6.35mm pistol that would become her signature weapon, a small gun that could be concealed in a handbag, but that required her to be within arm's length of her target to ensure a killing shot. The evening of the assassination was cold and clear, and Hannie positioned herself on a bench near the artist's zoo, pretending to read a book while her heart hammered against her ribs. When Xerxes passed by with his dog, she stood up, walked toward him, and fired 2 shots in his chest at point-blank range, so close that the muzzle flash scorched his uniform. She did not run immediately. Instead, she walked away at a normal pace, turning the corner before breaking into a sprint that carried her to a waiting bicycle and then to the safe house, where she would spend the next 3 days in hiding, shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline left her system. The killing of Willem Xerxes was the beginning of Hannie Schaft's reputation as the girl with the red hair, though she actually dyed her hair black for operations, and it marked her transformation from a supporting player in the resistance to one of its most effective and most wanted operatives. The weeks following her first kill were a crucible of fear and resolve for Hannie Schaft, as she moved between safe houses in Amsterdam and Haarlem, never sleeping in the same place twice, her dyed black hair growing out to reveal the natural red that would become both her trademark and her curse. The Gestapo response to Xerxes' assassination was immediate and brutal. 20 hostages were taken from the Jewish quarter and shot in reprisal, their bodies dumped in the street as a warning to the resistance. Hannie learned of this atrocity from an underground newspaper, reading the names of the dead in a cramped attic room while her hands trembled with a mixture of grief and guilt that would never fully leave her. She understood then, with terrible clarity, that the mathematics of resistance were cruel and uncompromising. Every German or collaborator she killed would be answered with innocent blood, and yet if she stopped fighting, the killing would continue anyway, only without opposition. This was the psychological landscape of occupied Europe, where moral clarity was a luxury that few could afford and where survival demanded the suppression of normal human responses. By January 1944, Hannie had been fully integrated into the most dangerous operations of the Rod van Verzet, working closely with 2 other legendary resistance fighters, Truus and Freddie Oversteegen, teenage sisters who had been conducting sabotage operations since the age of 14. The 3 women formed an unlikely but deadly team, their youth and gender providing perfect cover for operations that German security forces, fixated on male partisans and communist cells, consistently underestimated. Their missions ranged from the destruction of railway lines and power stations to the assassination of high-ranking SD, Sicherheitsdienst, officers, and they developed a methodology that combined meticulous planning with improvisational daring. Hannie, with her legal mind and gift for languages, became the planner of the group, responsible for intelligence gathering and escape routes, while the Oversteegen sisters handled the explosives and close-quarters combat. But it was Hannie who increasingly became the designated shooter in assassination operations, her steady nerve and ability to approach targets without arousing suspicion making her invaluable for the most sensitive hits. In February 1944, she carried out her second major assassination, killing a German intelligence officer named Hermann Wegner, who had been responsible for the torture and execution of at least 30 resistance members. Wegner was a creature of habit, dining every Thursday evening at the same restaurant on the Rembrandtplein, and Hannie spent 3 weeks establishing this pattern, noting the position of his preferred table, the habits of his bodyguards, and the layout of the kitchen that would provide her escape route. The operation required her to pose as a waitress, and she spent days practicing with the restaurant's actual staff, learning to carry heavy trays and memorize orders until her performance was flawless. On the night of February 17th, she served Wegner his schnitzel and beer, her hands steady as she set down the plate, then retrieved her pistol from the pocket of her apron and shot him 3 times in the head before he could raise his fork. The bodyguards, seated at a nearby table, were momentarily paralyzed by shock. Their charge had been killed by a serving girl, and in those precious seconds, Hannie disappeared through the kitchen and into the maze of Amsterdam's back streets, shedding her apron and cap as she ran. The Wegner assassination sent shockwaves through the German occupation apparatus and earned Hannie a personal commendation from the leadership of the Rod van Verzet, but also brought her to the attention of the most dangerous man in the Netherlands, SS Obersturmbannführer Hans Albin Rauter, the higher SS and police leader for the occupied territory. Rauter was a fanatical Austrian Nazi who had implemented the systematic exploitation of the Dutch economy and the deportation of Dutch Jews with ruthless efficiency, and he viewed the resistance not as a military problem, but as a personal insult to German honor. He ordered a special task force formed to hunt down the girl with the red hair, assigning his best detective, a Dutch collaborator named Co Langendijk, to lead the investigation. Langendijk was a former police inspector who had thrown in his lot with the Germans early in the occupation, and he possessed an intimate knowledge of Amsterdam's criminal underworld and resistance networks that made him uniquely dangerous. He began systematically dismantling the Rod van Verzet's infrastructure, using torture to extract information from captured members and following the money trails that connected the communist resistance to its funding sources. By April 1944, Hannie was forced to abandon her Haarlem base and go fully underground. Living in a series of safe houses that changed weekly, her contact with her family severed completely to protect them from reprisals. Her parents knew only that she was working for the resistance, and they would not learn the full extent of her activities until after the war. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of this period. Hannie was a sociable young woman who thrived on intellectual conversation and friendship, and the necessity of constant vigilance, of trusting no one completely and revealing nothing of her true self, began to take a psychological toll that she documented in coded diary entries. "I am becoming a ghost," she wrote in April 1944, "a creature shadows who exists only in the spaces between other people's lives. Sometimes I forget what my own voice sounds like when I am not performing a role." Yet she never wavered in her commitment to the struggle, and in the spring of 1944, she undertook her most ambitious operation yet: the infiltration of the German military administration in The Hague to assassinate General Hendrik Seefaert, the commander of the Dutch Legion of the Waffen-SS. Seefaert was a former Dutch army officer who had volunteered to lead collaborationist troops on the Eastern Front, and his recruitment efforts were luring thousands of Dutch young men into German service. The resistance leadership had determined that his elimination would strike a devastating blow to the collaborationist movement, but it would require getting close to one of the most heavily guarded men in the Netherlands. Hannie spent 2 months preparing for this mission, establishing a false identity as a German secretary named Hilda and securing a position in the administrative offices of the Dutch Legion. She went to work every day in a gray uniform, typing reports and filing documents while she studied the building's security arrangements and Seefaert's daily routine. The general was arrogant and predictable, arriving at his office at precisely 9 a.m. each morning and leaving for lunch at 1 p.m., and he was fond of flirting with the female staff, which Hannie used to her advantage. She positioned herself to catch his eye, accepting his compliments with downcast eyes and modest smiles, until he began to request her specifically for errands and dictation. On the morning of February 6, 1945, though some sources placed this assassination in late 1944, Hannie was waiting in the corridor outside Seefaert's office when he emerged, and, as he leaned in to whisper a suggestive comment, she drew her pistol and shot him twice in the chest. The general collapsed against the wall, his eyes wide with incomprehension, and Hannie walked calmly past his falling body, down the stairs, and out into the street, where she disappeared into the morning crowd before the alarm could be raised. Seefaert died of his wounds 3 days later, and the assassination was a triumph for the resistance. But it was also the operation that would ultimately seal Hannie Schaft's fate. The assassination of General Seefaert transformed Hannie Schaft from a valuable resistance operative into a symbol of Dutch defiance. Her face, sketched from witness descriptions, plastered on wanted posters across the occupied Netherlands. The reward for her capture doubled, and then tripled as the Gestapo grew increasingly desperate. The German response was not limited to propaganda. Rauter ordered a sweeping crackdown that arrested over 400 suspected resistance members in the following weeks, subjecting them to systematic torture in the infamous Orange Hotel prison in Scheveningen. Hannie watched this bloodshed from the shadows, hidden in a safe house in the Jordan district of Amsterdam, where she spent March and April of 1945 in a state of enforced inactivity that grated against every instinct in her body. She was not built for waiting. She was a woman of action whose identity had become inseparable from the struggle, and the necessity of remaining hidden while her comrades were hunted and killed was a torment that she described in her diary as worse than any physical pain. Yet she was also pragmatic enough to understand that her survival was essential to the resistance network she had helped build, and she used this period of concealment to plan future operations and to train new recruits who were being drawn to the underground by the growing certainty that the war was turning against Germany. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 had been followed by the liberation of southern Netherlands in the autumn, but the northern provinces remained firmly under German control, and the winter of 1944-45 brought the Hunger Winter, a man-made famine engineered by the German occupation authorities that would claim over 20,000 Dutch lives. Hannie emerged from hiding in late April 1945, as the Allied armies were advancing rapidly from the east and the German position was collapsing, to undertake what would be her final mission: the assassination of a Dutch collaborator named Fake Christ, a particularly vicious police detective who had personally tortured and murdered at least 50 resistance members and who was known to be preparing to flee to Germany with a cache of incriminating documents. The resistance leadership wanted Christ eliminated both as retribution for his crimes and to prevent him from using his documents to blackmail former collaborators in the post-war period. The operation was complicated by the chaotic conditions of the war's final days. German units were retreating through the Netherlands in disorder, Allied aircraft were attacking anything that moved on the roads, and the lines between occupied and liberated territory were shifting daily. Hannie and her partner for this mission, a young resistance fighter named Jan Boonkamp, spent 3 days tracking Christ's movements, establishing that he was traveling between The Hague and Leiden in a black Mercedes accompanied by 2 bodyguards. They decided to ambush him on a quiet stretch of road near the village of Velsen-Noord, where the dunes provided cover for an approach and the traffic was light enough that they could control the scene. On the morning of March 21, 1945, though the exact date remains disputed in some sources, they positioned themselves along the road, Hannie with her trusted 6.35 mm pistol and Boonkamp with a stolen German submachine gun. When Christ's Mercedes appeared, Boonkamp stepped into the road to halt it, firing a burst into the engine block to disable the vehicle. The bodyguard emerged with their hands raised, but Christ remained in the back seat, reaching for his own weapon, and Hannie approached the car to finish the job at point-blank range. She opened the door, looked into the eyes of the man who had caused so much suffering, and pulled the trigger twice. But the pistol misfired, or perhaps she had forgotten to chamber a round in her haste. Accounts differ, and in that moment of hesitation, Christ produced his own gun and shot her in the stomach. Boonkamp killed Christ with a burst from his submachine gun, but the damage was done. Hannie was bleeding profusely, unable to walk, and the sound of the gunfire was drawing German patrol from a nearby checkpoint. Boonkamp tried to carry her, but she was too heavy and the pursuit was too close, and she ordered him to leave her, to save himself and the resistance network that would be compromised if he were captured. He refused at first, weeping and cursing, but she was insistent, pressing her pistol into his hand and whispering that she would find another way, that he must go, must survive to see the liberation. He left her there in the dunes, propped against a concrete bunker, and she watched him disappear into the sea mist before turning her attention to her own predicament. She was 24 years old, bleeding to death in the sand, and the Germans were coming. What happened next is the subject of some historical debate, but the most reliable accounts suggest that Hannie attempted to crawl away from the scene, leaving a trail of blood that was easily followed by the German soldiers who arrived minutes later. She was still conscious when they found her, and she gave them a false name. Hannie was all she would say, refusing to provide a surname or any information about her contacts. The Germans, recognizing her red hair and the description from the wanted posters, knew exactly who they had captured, and there was a moment of almost respectful silence as the soldiers realized that this slight, wounded woman was the assassin who had eluded them for 2 years. They carried her to a military hospital in Beverwijk, where surgeons removed the bullet from her abdomen but declined to provide further treatment beyond the most basic wound care. The Gestapo wanted her alive for interrogation, and they were willing to let her suffer to ensure that she would be conscious and cooperative when the questioning began. For 3 days, Hannie Schaft lay in a hospital bed, feverish and in agony, guarded by SS men who took shifts watching her every movement. She was given water, but little food and no pain medication, and yet she refused to speak beyond the bare minimum required to maintain her cover story. She claimed to be a simple courier who had been forced to participate in the Christ assassination under duress, and she provided names that either did not exist or belonged to resistance members who were already dead or in hiding. The Gestapo interrogators, led by a brutal officer named Ernst Knorr, were frustrated by her silence and increasingly desperate as the Allied advance continued. They knew that the war was ending and that their window for extracting information was closing rapidly. On April 7, 1945, less than a month before the German surrender in the Netherlands, Knorr received authorization from Rauter to execute Hannie Schaft if she continued to refuse cooperation. The decision was controversial even within the German administration. Some officers argued that she should be preserved as a hostage for post-war negotiations, but Rauter was vindictive and increasingly unhinged, determined to eliminate this symbol of Dutch resistance before it could be celebrated in victory. In the early hours of April 17, 1945, 2 Dutch SS men entered Hannie's hospital room and ordered her to dress. She was barely able to stand, her wound still open and weeping, but she managed to pull on the clothes they provided, a simple dress and coat that had belonged to another prisoner, and to walk, supported between her captors, to a waiting car. They drove her to the dunes near Bloemendal, the same coastal landscape where she had carried out so many operations, and marched her to a pre-dug grave among the seagrass. According to the post-war testimony of one of her executioners, Hannie Schaft faced her death with extraordinary composure, refusing the blindfold that was offered and looking her killers directly in the eyes. Her last words, spoken in German, were a final act of defiance. "I shoot better than you," a reference to her earlier assassination successes and a contemptuous dismissal of the men who were about to murder an unarmed, wounded woman. The first volley wounded her, but did not kill her, and she collapsed into the grave, bleeding and moaning, until one of the executioners descended to deliver the coup de grace with a pistol shot to the head. She was buried in the sand. Her red hair, the last thing visible before the shovels covered her, and the men who killed her returned to their barracks to await the end of the war. The liberation of the Netherlands in early May 1945 brought with it a tumultuous mixture of joy and grief, as Dutch citizens poured into the streets to celebrate the end of 5 years of occupation, while simultaneously confronting the terrible human cost of that struggle. For the Schaft family, the victory was hollow. They had received no word from Hannie since the previous autumn, and their inquiries to the authorities, both the returning Dutch government and the Allied military administration, yielded only frustrating silence. It was not until June 1945, when a former resistance member who had been imprisoned in Beverwijk came forward with information about a wounded red-haired woman who had been treated in the military hospital, that they began to piece together what had happened to their daughter. The trail led to the dunes near Bloemendal, where a search party organized by the Schaft family and Hannie's former resistance combs discovered disturbed earth and, upon excavation, the remains of 3 bodies, 2 men and 1 woman, the latter with a bullet wound to the skull and remnants of red hair still visible on skull. The identification was confirmed through dental records and personal effects, and on November 27, 1945, Hannie Schaft was reburied with full honors in the cemetery of the Dutch honorary list in Bloemendal, her coffin draped in the red, white, and blue of the Dutch flag that she had fought so desperately to restore. The funeral was attended by thousands of people, including the entire leadership of the Raad van Verzet and representatives of the Dutch government, and it marked the beginning of Hannie Schaft's transformation from a resistance fighter into a national symbol. But the story of her death was not yet complete, for the question of justice remained to be answered, and the Netherlands, like all of occupied Europe, was grappling with the complex and emotionally charged process of dealing with collaborators and war criminals. The two Dutch SS men who had executed Hannie Schaft were identified through interrogations of German prisoners and capture documents, and they were arrested in the autumn of 1945. Their trial, which began in December of that year, was one of the first major war crimes proceedings in the Netherlands, and it attracted enormous public attention as the details of Hannie's final days were revealed in testimony. The defendants, whose names were Martin Kuiper and his subordinate, attempted to argue that they had been following orders and that Hannie had been legally sentenced to death by a German military court. But the prosecution produced evidence that no such court had convened and that the execution had been a summary murder order by Ernst Knorr without any legal process. The trial also brought to light the broader context of German atrocities in the final weeks of the occupation, as the Nazi regime, knowing that defeat was imminent, had engaged in a spree of executions of political prisoners and resistance members that served no military purpose and was motivated purely by vengeance. Kuiper and his accomplice were convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death, and they were executed by firing squad in March 1946. Their bodies buried in unmarked graves as a deliberate contrast to the honorable resting place they had provided for their victim. Ernst Knorr, the Gestapo officer who had ordered Hannie's execution, had fled to Germany and was not apprehended until 1948, when he was extradited to the Netherlands to stand trial. His case was more complex, as he argued that he had been acting under the authority of Hans Albin Rauter and that the execution of resistance fighters was legally sanctioned under German occupation law. The Dutch court rejected this defense, ruling that the German occupation had been illegal from the beginning and that all acts of violence against Dutch citizens, including those carried out under the guise of military law, were therefore criminal. Knorr was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, though he would serve only 12 years before being released in a general amnesty of 1960. A decision that sparked public outrage and that many Dutch citizens, including Hannie's surviving comrades, viewed as a betrayal of justice. The case of Rauter himself was even more consequential. The former SS leader was captured by British forces in Germany in 1945 and extradited to the Netherlands, where he was tried for war crimes, including the execution of Hannie Schaft and the deportation of over 100,000 Dutch Jews to the death camps. His trial, which lasted from October 1948 to January 1949, was the most significant war crimes proceeding in Dutch history, and it established important legal precedents regarding the responsibility of occupation officials for atrocities committed under their command. Rauter was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death, and he was executed by firing squad on March 25, 1949, at the same site in the dunes where Hannie Schaft had been murdered 4 years earlier. A symmetry of justice that provided some measure of closure to those who had loved her. But the legal proceedings, however necessary, could not fully capture the complexity of Hannie Schaft's legacy, for she had been not merely a victim, but an active participant in a dirty war that had required her to make choices that no young woman should have to face. The post-war Netherlands was eager to celebrate her as a hero, and her image, red hair flowing, pistol in hand, became a staple of patriotic commemorations. But there were also voices that questioned whether the glorification of political violence was appropriate for a democratic society seeking to rebuild on principles of law and reconciliation. Hannie's own writings, which were published in edited form in 1946, revealed a thoughtful and morally serious young woman who had been fully aware of the costs of her choices and who had struggled to maintain her humanity in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy it. "I am not a natural killer," she had written in her diary in 1944, "but I have become one because the alternative was to be a natural victim, and I could not accept that." This self-awareness distinguished her from the cartoonish image of the fanatical partisan, and it made her a more compelling but also more troubling figure for a society that wanted its heroes to be uncomplicated. The communist affiliation of the Rod van Verzet also complicated her legacy in the emerging Cold War context. The Netherlands was firmly aligned with the Western Alliance, and there were powerful interests that sought to downplay the role of communist resistance organizations in favor of emphasizing the contributions of conservative and religious groups. Hannie Schaft's political beliefs, she had joined the Communist Party of the Netherlands in 1943, were systematically minimized in official commemorations, and for many years, her story was told in ways that emphasized her Dutch patriotism while obscuring her ideological commitments. It was not until the 1980s, when a new generation of Dutch historians began to challenge the sanitized narratives of the resistance, that a more complete and honest account of her life and motivations became possible. The rehabilitation of Hannie Schaft's full legacy began in earnest with the 1981 publication of Het Verscholen Verleden, The Hidden Past, by historian Mieke Aerts, a scholarly work that placed her resistance activities within the broader context of communist opposition to fascism and that challenged the Cold War-era silence about her political beliefs. This academic reconsideration coincided with a cultural shift in the Netherlands toward greater openness about the complexities of the war years, including the uncomfortable realities of collaboration, the limitations of non-communist resistance, and the specific vulnerabilities of Jewish Dutch citizens who had been abandoned by many of their neighbors. Hannie Schaft emerged from this re-examination as a more fully realized historical figure. Neither the one-dimensional heroine of official propaganda nor the dangerous radical feared by conservative commentators, but a young woman of exceptional courage and moral clarity who had made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. Her story resonated particularly with feminist historians, who noted that her effectiveness as a resistance fighter had depended precisely on the gendered assumptions of her enemies, and that her success exposed the blind spots of a German security apparatus that could not conceive of women as serious threats. The 1990s saw a proliferation of biographies, documentaries, and theatrical works exploring her life, including the 1995 feature film The Girl with the Red Hair, starring Renée Setendik, which brought her story to international audiences and established her as one of the most recognizable resistance figures of World War II. The film, while taking some liberties with historical detail, captured the essential tragedy of her final days and the romantic poignancy of her brief, intense life, and it sparked renewed interest in the experiences of women in the European resistance. In the Netherlands itself, Hannie Schaft became the subject of an annual commemoration held on November 27th, the anniversary of her reburial, at which surviving resistance members, government officials, and ordinary citizens gather at her grave in Bloemendaal to honor her memory and to reflect on the continuing relevance of her example. The commemoration has evolved over the decades from a primarily patriotic ceremony into a more inclusive event that acknowledges the diversity of the resistance and the ongoing struggle against fascism and intolerance in contemporary Europe. In 2020, the 75th anniversary of her death, the ceremony was particularly poignant, coming at a moment of global pandemic and rising nationalist extremism that seemed to echo the conditions that had produced the war she fought against. The legacy of Hannie Schaft also extends into the material culture of remembrance. Her personal effects, including her pistol, her forged identity papers, and her diary, are preserved in the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam, where they serve as tangible connections to a past that grows more distant with each passing year. The museum's curators have worked to contextualize these objects within the broader history of the occupation, using Hannie's story to illuminate the experiences of the thousands of ordinary Dutch people who made extraordinary choices when confronted with Nazi tyranny. Her childhood home in Haarlem has been marked with a commemorative plaque, and a street in the city bears her name, as do schools and public buildings throughout the Netherlands, a form of secular canonization that reflect her status as a moral exemplar for subsequent generations. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her legacy is the ongoing debate about the ethics of political violence that her story continues to provoke. In an age of terrorism and asymmetric warfare, the question of when, if ever, it is permissible to kill for a political cause remains urgently relevant, and Hannie Schaft's example offers no easy answers. She was not a terrorist in the contemporary sense, for she targeted specific individuals responsible for specific crimes rather than seeking to terrorize civilian populations, and she operated within a structured resistance organization with clear political goals rather than as a lone wolf motivated by personal grievance or religious fanaticism. Yet she did kill in cold blood, and she did so repeatedly, developing the emotional detachment necessary to approach her targets at point-blank range and to watch them die. The psychological cost of these actions, evident in her diary entries and in the testimony of those who knew her, suggests that she was not immune to moral injury, and that her heroism lay precisely in her willingness to bear that injury for the sake of a greater good. This is the complex legacy that she bequeaths to the present, a reminder that resistance to tyranny may require terrible choices, and that those who make such choices deserve our respect and our compassion, but not our uncritical adulation. Hannie Schaft died at 24 before she could marry, have children, or pursue the legal career she had dreamed of, and her life thus represents both the possibility of extraordinary achievement in a short span and the tragic waste of war. The Netherlands she fought to liberate has become one of the most prosperous and tolerant societies in the world, and while she cannot be given sole credit for this outcome, her example contributed to the moral foundation upon which that society was rebuilt. In the final analysis, her story endures because it speaks to the capacity of ordinary individuals to transcend their circumstances through acts of courage and conviction, and because it reminds us that the struggle against oppression is never truly finished, but must be renewed in every generation. The girl with the red hair, who once pedaled her bicycle past German checkpoints with death hidden in her basket, has become a permanent part of the Dutch national consciousness. Her name invoked in times of crisis as a symbol of the refusal to submit to evil. As long as there are tyrants and collaborators, occupiers and informants, her example will remain relevant, and her sacrifice will continue to inspire those who choose to resist.